Hi, my name is Faith Payne, and today we're going to be talking about the different aspects of research studies in a presentation that I've entitled, What Do I Do with this Hypothesis? The objectives of this presentation are to first justify the need for institutional review boards from history. Second, to describe the three types of reviews completed by the IRB. Next, to describe special populations that are protected by the IRB. Then we will describe how to choose a sample size, research protocol, different research instruments, and how to debrief after a research study, and finally, to identify the rationale for using pilot studies. The first step after deciding on a research design is to obtain approval from the IRB. You may wonder why this is an important step and must be obtained before any other part of the research design can be implemented. It is important to have an understanding of what caused the need for IRBs. The group that initially brought to light the need for human protection were the Nazi doctors that committed many atrocities to human beings in the name of research. Some of these physicians would later stand trial for the research they completed, and 10 principles were initially developed to protect human subjects, called the Nuremberg Code. The most important aspect of the code was the need for people to consent to the research trial in which they were participating. It is easy to take a holier-than-thou approach and say what awful things the Germans did during World War II, and it was truly awful, but that being compared to the U.S. study on syphilis that took place in Tuskegee. The result of that research study being brought to light was the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report stated that human research participants should be treated with respect, beneficence, and justice. In 1974, the National Research Act established the modern IRB. In 1991, the Common Rule, or federal policy for the protection of human subjects, was formally adopted to ensure the protection of human participants in research studies. It's important to understand the reason for the IRB and why this is such an important part of the research process. As Maya Angelou said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. The primary purpose of the IRB is the welfare of the human participant. The researcher must submit the research design in detail to the IRB to make a decision about the study. The researcher must decide how they will conduct the research and the participants that will be used. Then the IRB must make a decision about what the risks to the participants are and what the perceived benefits of the study are. The IRB must then decide whether or not to allow the study based on the risk to the participants. The decision of the IRB is final, and so a study that does not meet IRB approval will not be conducted. There are 3 types of reviews conducted by the IRB. The first is an exempt study. This one, there's minimal risk to the participants, or no risk at all. This does not require IRB approval. An example would be comparing different educational strategies in a classroom in a group of college students. An expedited review is one in which minimal risk is perceived to the participants. An example would be a focus group. This may cause some psychological risk. A full review would be implemented if the risk is high or with any special population that is considered high risk. An example of this would be a drug trial or any trial involving children or prisoners. The researcher does not decide the review status, but is instead decided by the IRB. There are special populations that are considered especially vulnerable and must always have IRB approval. These special populations are people with cognitive impairments, children, and prisoners. The major ethical concern with those that are cognitively impaired is the ability to understand what they are agreeing to in a research study. It is imperative that the researcher is aware if a person can actually consent to the research trial. Not everyone with a cognitive impairment is incapable of consenting to a research trial. If a person is unable to consent to the research trial, it is the duty of the researcher to find the individual legally responsible for the person to obtain consent from. Children are considered a vulnerable group in research. There are 4 categories concerning children in research in which the IRB will grant permission for the study. The 4 categories are: first, there is not more than minimal risk to the child. Second, there's greater than minimal risk, but the potential benefits can actually occur for that child. Third, there's greater than minimal risk and potentially doesn't provide any benefit to that child, but can add knowledge about the child's disorder or condition. Fourth, the research is not usually approved, but presents an opportunity to understand, prevent, or alleviate a serious problem affecting the health or welfare of children. Once approval is gained by the IRB, consent is obtained from the child's legal guardian, and the child must also assent to the study if they're at a certain age. Usually the age is considered around age 4. A full review is also sought for prisoners because prisoners may feel that they're not in a position to decline being part of a research study. In order for prisoners to be considered part of the study, there must be minimal risk to the prisoner, either physically or psychologically, if there's any risk at all. Once IRB approval is obtained, it's now time to select the sample size and obtain consent from the participants. The researcher must decide the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the participants in the study. The researcher must come up with a strategy to recruit the participants that they need for the study. The researcher should recruit a sample size based on the design. The sample size should be large enough to adequately prove the relationship between the independent and dependent variable, but should also be small enough to be cost effective. Once an adequate number of participants are recruited, they must give consent to be part of the research trial. This consent should include all aspects of the study, should be easy to understand, and provide enough information for participants to decide if they'd like to participate in the study. Another important aspect of the consent is that they can withdraw from the study at any point. It is important for the researcher to specify all details of the research plan to be carried out during the trial. These details include everything up to the sequence of events and the steps in the data collection process. They have to develop a plan to how the participants are greeted and any nonverbal communication with the researcher or whoever greets the participant, down to whether or not they smile at them or nod at them. Research instruments are the method by which the independent variable is manipulated and the dependent variable is measured. The researcher can be an integral part of both how the independent variable is manipulated and how the dependent variable is measured. This is kind of the least reliable of methods because the researcher may have their own bias. The next can be an electronic device, such as something pops up on a Christensen and all said, something pops up on a screen, somebody has a pulse ox on their finger that measures their heart rate. It can be even more sophisticated devices, such as measuring brain waves with an EEG or an MRI or a PET scan. During the data collection process, whatever the researcher determined was the tool that was going to be used to collect the data, that's what they should follow exactly. The tool should be validated prior to gathering data to ensure that we have correct data to draw our conclusions from. During the debrief, this is the end point of research for participants. We shouldn't just look at the participants after they've participated and say, see you later. This is a point where we get to talk to them about what happened during the trial. There are 3 functions. Ethical. So if during any point of the research there was actually some deception that occurred, that can be cleared up. It can be educational. This is why you were participating. Methodological. Did we do exactly what we said we were going to do through the trial? There can be 2 questions, 2 methods. There can be a questionnaire or face-to-face. Kind of the downside of using a questionnaire is people won't write down everything they think on a piece of paper. And face-to-face, during the debrief, it gives the researcher time to ask more questions about what actually occurred, have more open-ended questions. A pilot study is the entire experiment on a small scale. The purpose of a pilot study is to indicate whether the independent variable manipulation produced the intended effect. The benefit is this happens on such a small scale, it's more cost effective that way. That way we can find out if this even does what we want it to do. Another benefit is that we can kind of work out the kinks in the research design. So we thought we would run it this way. The pilot study shows that doesn't work. There's confusion, whatever. This gives us that opportunity to try it out before we have the big study in effect. In conclusion, after deciding on the design, we must obtain IRB approval. We must ensure that the sample size is small enough to be cost effective, but large enough to prove a relationship. It is imperative that we ensure strict adherence to the research plan. A pilot study is an effective way to test a theory with less cost to ensure the value of the study. Here are the references that I use. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.